Thank you so much. My name is Elizabeth Christensen. I'm with Department of Environmental Quality. I'd love to know who else is in the room. Are there any state government representatives, local government representatives? Oh, hey. Nonprofits, corporations, government, or industry folks? All right, nice. Who else? Did I miss somebody? Sector? All right, cool. Thanks. Good to see all of you. Good to meet you. So I'm a senior policy advisor at DEQ, and I also am the project lead for the Flood Resiliency Blueprint. DEQ is the lead stewardship agency for the protection of North Carolina environmental resources, and we have 10 divisions. Some of them are regulatory, and some of them help distribute grants. And this Flood Resiliency Blueprint is in the Division of Mitigation Services. And so part of our core team is the Director of Division Mitigation Services, Mark Rechtenwald, and the project manager is Michelle Faree, also in the Division of Mitigation Services. I presented this to the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee on Agriculture and Natural and Economic Resources about a month ago. And Representative Jimmy Dixon likened funding flood resiliency projects in North Carolina to throwing darts at a board. That we at the state don't have a full picture of how to prioritize flood mitigation projects, which give the most benefit to an entire basin. And so people ask, well, why don't we do natural solutions? Why don't we do stormwater controls? What about storage? What about relocation? What about buyouts? And the list goes on about like these great ideas for what we should do for flood mitigation. But we don't have a great method to evaluate what happens if we choose a suite of mitigation options and see what those impacts are on a basin scale. And so how can we reduce those impacts or not reduce those impacts if a big hurricane comes through? So that's sort of the basis for this flood resiliency blueprint. And in 2021, the General Assembly allocated $20 million to the Division of Mitigation Services to develop this flood resiliency blueprint. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll highlight 3 pieces. The first is that it shall form the backbone of a state flood planning process, that it should direct funds which are central to the creation of an actionable blueprint for flood risk assessment, to identify data gaps, and to provide recommendations to reduce flood risk for watersheds in North Carolina from the local level, local subbasins, all the way up to the Neuse Basin, Cape Fear Basin. And we have a draft due in December 2023. So I just want to pause and say that this is a flood resiliency blueprint. We know that there is recovery underway, that has to happen quickly for those who are impacted by flood events in North Carolina. That happens a lot, and that need is there. But resiliency is long-term planning. And so this North Carolina resiliency blueprint is in the resiliency space. And so the DEQ goal for the flood resiliency blueprint, as informed by the General Assembly, is to develop a blueprint as an actionable online decision support tool, to develop an action strategy for every major basin in North Carolina, to allow state agencies, regional and local government planners, lawmakers, these are the end users, to prioritize and direct resources to implement effective flood resilience strategies. And so these end users need to be able to visualize flood risk. They need to be able to select mitigation alternatives, and they need to be able to understand the impacts of these choices on communities and be able to prioritize things based on decision maker values and community values. So what does it mean to visualize flood risk? It means ensuring we understand not only current flood hazard conditions, but also future. It means we need to understand and look at stormwater, riverine, storm surge, and other kinds of flooding. For mitigation scenarios, our ideal tool would show us the impacts from different flood mitigation strategies, from nature-based solutions, structural, non-structural approaches. I have up here a picture of stormwater controls, potentially raising a bridge, water farming, and wetland reconstruction. And we're not trying to evaluate ahead of time what type of mitigation option is or isn't best. We want the data and the model to show us what the impacts are and allow the decision makers to rank things based on the priorities that they have. In terms of impacts, we want to understand the impacts of choosing a suite of mitigation options because we know flooding impacts people, their homes, businesses, agriculture, energy, and critical infrastructure. This was I-40 back in 2019. And so how are we going to do this? This is a big vision. This has never been done before in any other state. Right before I spoke, you spoke about flood.nc.gov. And that's a great tool. And this is going beyond that. We want this to go beyond that to be able to have a feedback loop about if we know where the flood extent is and we choose different mitigation options, what does that then do to reduce flood risk? And so we have two strategies for developing this tool. The first is statewide, top-down, and also basin-specific, bottom-up. We know every basin's different. Their needs are different. Water's local. Every community is different. Every municipality is different. And so since this is a statewide process, we know that it needs to be dependent on the data and models available. I've mentioned before, we need to be able to visualize flood risk for different risk conditions, choose from a suite of mitigation options and strategies, understand cost estimates and funding sources, receive recommendations about long-term administration and maintenance. This isn't just a 1 or 2 year thing, it's a long-term program. Recommendations for governance and decision-making. For the statewide approach, and so because basins are different, we need to develop different action strategies to identify the specific needs of the basin and identify the best data and modeling we have now, while also knowing that we need to build towards the future to a common statewide model. And so in terms of our timeline overall, in 2022, we received the allocated funds from the General Assembly, and Division of Mitigation Services worked to develop a scope of work and awarded a bid to the selected vendor, AECOM. In 2023, outputs are to develop the requirements for an online decision support tool, draft the North Carolina Flood Resiliency Blueprint, and pilot that blueprint, developing an action strategy in the Neuse Basin, and beta testing this online decision support tool. Why are we starting with the Neuse? It is likely the most data-rich basin in the state, and we have full intention in 2024 to go statewide and develop action strategies for the other 16 basins in the state. And 2025 and onward is, blueprint program. And so this is just a brief high-level overview of the selected vendor, AECOM, with their teams. Some of the methods they're using for this 2023 is stakeholder outreach and engagement, conducting a gap analysis, providing recommendations and a decision framework, and then, of course, building the draft blueprint and pilot basin. So I'll just briefly go through a few of those pieces. So first, for outreach and engagement, so AECOM was selected as the vendor December 28th, 2022. So we're just in our first, phase of getting things going. And next week, we have our first technical advisory group kickoff meeting. So this is our first arm of our outreach and engagement, to have advisory groups. We've invited over 100 people across the state, from federal, state, local, county, council of government, tribal, nonprofit, public, interest groups from all over the state. We have at least 90 confirmed attendees to provide input from all of these sectors across the state on the deliverables and reports that are coming out to build this draft blueprint. Our second arm of outreach engagement is community-centered. We know floods impact real people, historically marginalized groups especially, and so as we're developing the statewide blueprint, we're calling it boots on the ground. Our core team's going to select communities, meeting with local elected officials and meeting with underserved communities to hear their stories and really try to understand what their preferred mitigation options might be. Make sure we're taking that into account as we're developing a draft statewide scope, and also getting a preview for action strategies for basin-specific, more detailed plans. And then public Q&A as well as there. Our third arm is focused on our end users, making sure that our beta tool can be technically functional with local governments, with other state agencies, as well as making sure that we hear what types of outputs they want and need. We've heard some things already, but this is part of our process. This slide is just a snapshot of the many partners that have already helped us. This is a snapshot of in 2022 of groups and agencies and stakeholders that DEQ and Division of Mitigation Services spoke with or reached out to or heard from, developing the scope of work for our first phase. In terms of a gap analysis, the purpose of a gap analysis is to help understand what resources are needed to develop a blueprint. This is, I think, perhaps especially relevant at the GIS conference here, knowing what data is available. As a state agency, we need to focus on open source, publicly available data, what data are available, and also what models are available. And so we know already that we don't have, for example, 2D hydraulic and hydrologic models for the entire state. And so if that is our tier one, what we want and need for the whole state, how do we make decisions now using tier two or tier three kinds of models or data? And so that's part of this process in the gap analysis, is to try to understand what are the best data and models we have now, while also building towards something that we want in the future. Third is providing recommendations and a decision framework. So this is just why scalability matters. From having a statewide scale, we know that each basin's different, and so as we're developing a tool, even though we have a pilot in the news, we know that it needs to be populated with specific information and priorities from the other basins, whether there's mountains, landslides, coastal, have storm surge, as well as just different community priorities. And so this is just a very initial concept, so we haven't gone through our technical advisor review, but in terms of a concept of what this tool could look like, is to first have a tool that understands the risk scores at the structure level or sub-basin scale, and then running an alternative analysis after choosing mitigation scenarios to update those risk scores so you have an understanding of how those mitigation scenarios may or may not impact your basins or sub-basins. And then being able to view the impacts or priorities. That includes potentially funding and tracking, as well as, we've heard from municipalities that having, for example, pre-populated grant applications for high priority mitigation options could be helpful. And so things like that are what we're thinking of in terms of reporting requirements or reporting needs and desires. And with that, I think I close with, this is the first of its kind program. It's never been done before in the United States. Other states have developed other tools, but nothing that does this, feedback loop and provides specific reporting to municipalities and to end users. We know that it's a tremendous vision, and we know that we have a lot of interested parties in North Carolina, and we're really excited to get this going and have just hear a lot of input and kind of coalesce around a draft blueprint and tool. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions now, or as a government employee, you are welcome to email me at any time, and I will find an answer to your question. Thank you. All right.
So is the idea that the tool is going to support the use of a statewide risk assessment?
In some way, yes. So what? I mean, we know we have local models, for example, that already inform risk at the municipality level for different municipalities. Charlotte, some of the bigger cities have this. There's other hazard mapping plans, but there's not a common model for the entire state. And there's a lot of municipalities and smaller towns that don't have that ability to be able to do that. So yes, and. Yeah.
Long-term, tools up and running, how are y'all thinking that you want to, basically, what success look like? How is that going to work?
Yeah, good question. So I think we've talked about this, and success, I think, is it being used, because being able to track what impacts may or may not be. And so having a tool that helps articulate what the impacts of like reducing flood risk for a particular set of mitigation options, that's incredibly useful to propose policy changes, or to be able to put different pots of money towards a planned approach to flood resiliency. And so while this isn't money allocated to build projects, we can't evaluate did flood risk get reduced or not. we can evaluate it based on who's using it and is it useful to state and local folks. Yeah. Yeah.
As the FEMA, do we have FEMA 100-year flood map cover of coastline?
That's a good question.
Yeah, do we have FEMA 100 maps for
We do.
state?
Answer is yes. Answer is yes. We have FEMA 100-year event map floods for the state of North Carolina. Yes.
Well, my question actually piggybacks on that. The FEMA 100-year floodplain is not enough. It
That's
doesn't
right.
actually depict risk
That's
in
right.
any kind of realistic way anymore, as
That's
we
right.
know. Are there conversations to think about how we can potentially better map flood risk in the 5 to 1,000, and basically plan at, say, the 1,000-year flood risk level, which is what we really should be doing?
Absolutely. So this is actually trying to look at any structure. What is the risk? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Supposed to be in one of the tasks.
Wonderful. Thank you for your participation. Yeah, and of course, then it's helpful to see what those 100-year boundaries are within that, but not limited to that. Yeah.
For the tool, how interactive are you wanting?
We want it to be very interactive.
So you're running like overland flow simulation for the flooding, and that's interacting with people putting in a drainage basin or a culvert.
Oh, interesting.
Like how responsive there, and based off of that, because it's a very computationally complex
Yeah.
like operations to do, a low level of I guess accuracy is necessary to help with decision making, without it truly being, you're gonna have some trade-offs. You can't have it both ways. That's gonna be too slow to interact.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that's part of the purpose of our technical advisory groups is as we're going through this process and to beta test the tool so that we can see, okay, are these end users wanting more of what you're describing? Or on the other hand, are there real capacity limitations and technical limitations for what an entity might be able to do? And so being able to provide really a guided tool, maybe set.
Even have a stormwater
Yeah,
GIS.
that's right.
Yes.
So yeah, so I think there's an opportunity to kind of see, are there potentially different kinds of end users, and what are the needs of the different kinds of end users? Yeah. Thanks for the questions.